Okay, so we're back with our discussion, a new discussion. We just finished our discussion of Locke. And of course, we finished our discussion of Locke with the final two or three chapters of the second treatise, which outline the conditions under which government dissolves. And as we discussed, it also very suggestively indicates that there may be occasions on which not just a people would be obligated to or in a position to judge and, if necessary, resist the actions of their legislature or their prince, but also that a individual, a single individual, might be in a position to do likewise. So, this idea that an individual might resist um, a government, not just resist a government's actions, not just, disobey. In America, we have this sort of rich tradition of civil disobedience. This is something more than civil disobedience. Recall the Rye House plot of 1683, in which a number of religious dissidents and radical Whigs had taken it upon themselves to assassinate not just a sitting and legitimate king, and I mean Charles II had as uh, solid of a claim to the throne as any English monarch had ever had. In fact, he probably had more solid of a claim because he was not only heir to the throne of Charles I, but he'd even been invited back by the British Parliament or by English Parliament during his exile. So he was uh, not only king by right, but also king by parliamentary decree. So this was a sitting monarch who everyone regarded as legitimate, and his brother, who stood to be the next king. And they had decided that so strong was their claim, so great were their fears, and so solid was their standing in this case that they were empowered to assassinate these guys and, if necessary, to institute a new form of government in England, not just a different king, but presumably, if the matter of Catholic kings was to be resolved permanently, some sort of veto power over who would be king would have to be lodged in Parliament. So this is, I guess, what we would today call political activism at a truly grand and potentially quite murderous scale. And of course, the legacy of this is very mixed. So in America, we have this very rich revolutionary tradition, which we're going to talk about today when we discuss Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. But we also have, a long tradition of fringe and radical groups who argue that special access to certain religious truths, special access to certain objective moral truths gives them not only the right but the obligation to commit something like murder. So, for example, the Oklahoma City bombings, you guys are too young to remember this, but this is something that happened when I was a kid. The Oklahoma City bombings were motivated by something like this view that certain fundamental rights had been violated and that these co-conspirators were um, morally empowered and obligated to do something about it. So the fundamental idea here that individuals themselves can serve as the judge as to whether or not their rights are being violated, and that these claims, the claims of individuals, the rights of individuals established in nature, are so strong that they can empower resistance and even violent resistance. This is a pretty radical claim. Um, we're going to kind of set it to the side, and we're going to focus more on this likewise radical, but uh, somewhat more moderate view that the people can themselves change their government. Now, again, there's a lot of questions around the sides of this. So, as you probably, it seems like one fact about U.S. history that almost all of my undergraduates come with is this three thirds fact, which is that at the time of the revolution, one third of the colonists supported the cause of independence, one third supported the cause of England, and one third were undecided. I think this is still historically, I think this is still to be the received case by historians. I actually don't know whether or not it's true. The accuracy of polling in 1776 strikes me as um, somewhat up for debate. Um, so there are, in other words, whenever we say the people are entitled to change their governments, there will always be questions about who constitutes the people, who gets to count for the people. And so the American Revolution, in other words, we could hardly say that it was prosecuted by the people, given the fact that certainly less than half of the colonists supported independence at the time. Likewise, during the constitutional conventions of 1787 to 1789, we know that the ratification process sought a kind of consensus, a broad consensus among the colonies. But at the same time, we also know that it was only the men doing the talking, and that it was only the whites doing the talking. So who counts as the people is always going to be a debate. But for the most part, what we find in Locke, in the view that we find in documents like the various declarations that we're going to take a look at today, is this notion that a people are empowered, as it were, to uh, essentially form the government that they want. And again, the proper context for this view isn't so much the kind of natural rights, natural law basis of individual resistance that we've been discussing and that we saw at the very end of Locke. The context is more so if we think back to chapters 8 and 9 of the second treatise, we remember that Locke had this sort of three-stage process for how we move from the state of nature into a government. So we recall that we're all sort of born into the state of nature. And in the state of nature, we're all free, equal, and independent. And that the only possible way for an individual to move from the state of nature, from the natural state in which he's free, equal, and independent with everyone else, into political society, at which point he's subject to regulation according to the wishes of the majority, is through consent. And every individual has to consent. Something we didn't talk about, and we'll just touch on very, very briefly now, is that, of course, this is a strange kind of doctrine to hold today, given the fact that everyone's already born into a government. So how can it be that um, uh, majorities rule according to the consent of the governed? If you paid close attention to the discussion in chapter 8, the discussion of consent, you notice that he kind of invents the idea of tacit consent. So essentially, Locke's view is that once you sort of take part in the political community, and he mostly means once you sort of take part in the regime of property relations. So once you inherit property, once you are employed, once you have enough money to sort of participate in the regime of property and to require protection of your property, you can be said to have tacitly consented to being a part of that regime. But in any case, we started free, equal, and independent in the state of nature. We consent one way or another to enter into political society. At the stage of political society, we are, he calls this political society, sometimes civil society. Another way of thinking about this is we've become a people. And what we've agreed to be is agreed to be ruled, as it were, by the majority of the people. Now, that doesn't mean that the people can violate our natural rights. It doesn't mean they can violate the laws of nature. We don't get any, like, if individuals can't violate the laws of nature, there are no circumstances under which individuals can violate the laws of nature in the state of nature. We don't suddenly acquire new moral powers just by combining with other people. So we don't get any new moral powers. We don't get any new rights. Essentially, what we do is we seek, in Locke's phrase, to perfect the laws of nature by combining one with another and subjecting ourselves to this collective rule. So this is the stage at which we become a people that Locke thinks, in the case of a malformed or a maladaptive or just bad behaving government, in the case that a government becomes injurious to our natural rights or becomes injurious to the scheme of the perfection of the laws of nature, then essentially what happens is the people can invoke, the people can say, listen, we are in control. We rule according to majority. We don't like this government anymore, and we want to create a new government. The name for this view, and of course, this relates back to the discussion that we've been having since Hobbes, the name for this view is popular sovereignty. So we in America, we are ruled according to the doctrine of popular sovereignty. This sometimes gets described as those governments are legitimate which have the consent of the governed, but this isn't really the case. It's not really a question of consent. What it means is that the people ultimately have sovereign authority here. We know that to be the case, even though we also think of the Constitution as exercising a kind of sovereignty right. But we recall the opening lines of the Constitution, which we'll look at next week. The opening lines of the Constitution are "We the people." So the Constitution represents a sovereign act undertaken by the people. So this idea that we, in this middle stage, we become a people, we've all individually consented to be governed by the majority of the collective will. This view is called popular sovereignty. And according to Locke, this doctrine of popular sovereignty it's pretty potent. It means, in a sort of highly technical sense, that at any time and really for any reason, the people can say, we no longer prefer this form of government and we wish to form another one. Uh, in other words, this popular sovereignty is really only bound by, on the one hand, the laws of nature, and on the other hand, its own will. It's only bound by whatever the majority of people that comprise that body want to have. So even though, as we'll see in the Declaration of Independence, the colonists are very conscious of providing as many reasons as they can for seeking independence and for enacting this right that remains with them at all times, you don't actually need any reasons. The people, as a sovereign body, if they're going to be sovereign, it means that ultimately they decide. In the same way that Hobbes is sovereign, doesn't need to cite scripture, doesn't need to cite the laws of nature, doesn't need to cite the common law when he enacts this or that policy. He can simply act, right? Because his will is what matters. Likewise with popular sovereignty. You can give reasons, the colonists gave reasons. You can cite the moral reasons. You can cite scripture if you wish, but a doctrine of popular sovereignty means that the people rule. Okay, so let's take a look at the Declaration of Independence and let's be particularly conscious about how this relates to what we've been talking about. Okay, so I won't belabor the discussion with too much context here. Presumably, uh, if you're familiar at all with the American founding, which I guess I can assume that because you guys are all Reach Act compliant. Uh, this South Carolina State Legislature's Reach Act requires you guys to read the Declaration at some point, along with some Federalist Papers, a few other things. So I can assume that you guys are familiar with this document and familiar with its history. Composed in 1776, we're going to treat Thomas Jefferson as the primary author here, despite the fact that he had some help from a few other members of the Revolutionary cadre. Interesting thing about Jefferson, of course, is that we know that he was familiar with Locke's Second Treatise. Not just familiar with it; it was one of just a handful of books that he required to be in every room at the University of Virginia. Some people have argued that the American Revolutionary tradition was sort of very eclectically about natural rights. John Adams himself, indicates as much in a letter that he wrote considerably after the fact, 40 some years after the fact, where he argued that the revolutionary literature was not inspired by any one particular writer, but that there was something just sort of in the air, in the water, as it were, and that the Americans had just begun to sort of speak and think in the fashion of natural rights and natural law. Whatever might be the case, we can look at the Declaration of Independence and see very clearly that it takes its inspiration from the Second Treatise, or at the very minimally, it takes its inspiration from a kind of discourse that has the Second Treatise as one of its primary works. So, if we take a look at the Declaration of Independence, right, we see the opening paragraph. which is a kind of forward or preamble. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which had connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So a couple interesting things here. On the one hand, so we often consider this a revolution. Strictly speaking, this wasn't much of a revolution for a couple reasons. Typically, revolution, so if we think about the revolution of, say, 1688, the English Revolution, the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, revolutions typically result in significant political changes. Likewise, the French Revolution of 1776, the various revolutions in Europe in 1812 and in 1848. Essentially, what you have is some unhappy faction within a social or political community who seeks some fundamental change in the regime. So the most obvious example of this is the French Revolution of 1789, where I mean, really, it was a sort of bottom-up rebuilding of not just French politics, but French society more generally. So a revolution is like an overturning, as it were, and an overturning at some level kind of requires serious changes to be made in the political institutions of a country. And what's interesting about the American case is that that's not really what happens, and in fact, it's not really what the Americans seek. So in the period, leading up to the revolution, the colonists sought various changes. They sought steadier and more effective representation in Parliament. They sought sturdier protections from the Crown against Parliament. They sought a few sort of marginal and some quite substantial changes in the tax policy regarding the colonies. But it's not as if the colonists were like, we want full and equal representation with the citizens of England. We want the seat of the British Empire to be moved here. We want a third chamber of parliament. They weren't saying anything like that. So what happened here wasn't really a revolution. Independence is a better description. And actually, of course, in a word that has been, for obvious reasons, somewhat tainted by subsequent American history, this is really an act of secession, where some body seeks to break off from its previous body in order to establish a new political entity of its own, or some part of the people seek to become a new people. Actually, in a weird way, the American Civil War, we often discuss it in terms of secession, but the Confederate States of America actually sought significant changes to the constitutional order before they enacted secession, meaning of the two major events in American history, the Revolution was probably closer to an act of pure independence or secession, whereas the American Civil War was probably closer to something like a revolution. The Confederate States really did seek to remake the American constitutional order in the image of slavery and a fundamental denial of the doctrine of universal human rights or universal rights that had comprised the American project up to that point. That's just a little aside. Okay, so here's the good stuff. Here's the juicy bits. This is the body of the document. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and we're going to go through this line by line. And really, what we're trying to do here is to connect this back with the views that we find in the second treatise. So already from the beginning, we have this phrase: "These truths to be self-evident." So, in other words, there are certain objective facts, truths out there in the world. These are moral truths, as we'll see. So there are moral facts, there are objective moral facts, and these objective moral facts are self-evident. Now, this is an interesting phrase. Self-evident might mean that the facts themselves refer to themselves, or that they are evident um, just by, in some sense, by their very existence, they become evident. But what's probably meant here, what Jefferson probably means, is that any rational individual, any rational person, anyone in with full possession of their senses, can understand these truths. So, in other words, they're self-evident in the way that, like, a geometric proof is self-evident. If you show someone the nature of a triangle, for example, and list certain axiomatic principles related to triangles, you can lead them down the path to show them that, the following things also are true of triangles. That's self-evident in the sense that you don't need to read the Bible, you don't need to read any textbooks on the subject, you don't need to read the relevant literature on this or that subject, you don't need to take a public opinion poll. This can be done within the confines of the human mind, as it were. So self-evident truths are truths that are evident to anyone with any grasp of their reason. And of course, as we saw from paragraph 6 in chapter 2 of Locke's second treatise, Locke says pretty much the same thing, that the laws of nature, that reason is the law of nature, and that anyone who will but consult their natural reason can see that they ought not to harm another in their life, liberty, or possessions. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. So here we have again this Lockean notion, which we've spent a bit of time distinguishing as sharply as we can from the Hobbesian view, the Lockean view of natural equality. For Locke, we are all naturally equal with one another, which means we are all of us bearers of certain moral qualities. And these moral qualities are, in this case, certain natural rights. So we are all of us enveloped, as it were, by the laws of nature. So in other words, we all have a kind of standing with respect to the laws of nature by virtue of our being human. And that standing is cashed out in terms of a set of natural rights. And these are universal. What are these natural rights? Well, note too, this word unalienable. So again, this is an ungrammatical, it should be inalienable. Apparently this was pointed out and they elected to go with unalienable. I think there's literature explaining why this is the case. I don't know it, but unalienable means you cannot ever give away these rights. And that was important partly because there were a series of arguments that stated that while it might have been the case that at some time in the past individuals were free, while it might have been the case that sometime in the past the people elected their kings or chose their kings in some way. In other words, while popular sovereignty might have been the case in the past, it was no longer the case. That at some point the people had realized that the principles of hereditary succession were so valuable to them, that the stability brought about from an inherited monarchy was so valuable that they gave away this right. And here Jefferson wants to make clear that no such giving away is possible. And the three rights that he lists are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, this is very close to Locke's life, liberty, and estate. And there's another literature as to why Jefferson chose this line of pursuit of happiness, but we're not going to go too far into it now. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So again, the fundamental relationship, which is that the natural rights come first and that government comes second. So the relationship between government and rights is, think of it this way. Somebody like Hobbes would say that whatever rights that we have, whatever useful rights, enforceable rights we have, i.e., my right to this or that piece of property, that these rights are generated by the sovereign. That I can't enforce anything in the state of nature, and I have no moral claims whatsoever. There are no conventions to refer to in the state of nature. State of nature is pure chaos, and then we invest, like we create order in this chaotic realm through covenanting, and then finally through the sovereign's authority. Jefferson, following Locke, reverses this. So there are already rights. There's already a normative moral order of things, and government is there to protect or instantiate or to recognize or to make clearer this moral order that's already in place. So we institute government to secure our natural rights, and governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed. So again, this view of popular sovereignty, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people. So again, he does not make reference to individuals here. It's the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing it in powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So there are essentially five rights here: rights to life, rights to liberty, rights to the pursuit of happiness, a right to alter or abolish bad forms of government, and a right to institute government. So, um, rights of government, rights of either instituting or abolishing, these comprise two of the five natural rights that Jefferson lists here. Now, we don't have a whole lot more to cover. We do note that the Declaration of Independence goes on to enumerate the various reasons, and again, they what they really are seeking to do here is to suggest that George III is guilty of certain crimes, not just against them, but against nature. But the basic framework here we can see, and we can see how it relates back to Locke's views. So the basic framework is, there is a moral order out there in the world. Individuals have rights according to this moral order. Among these rights are rights pertaining to government, and that if the people decide that a particular regime is injurious to them, or that it violates the laws of nature, that it is among their rights to institute a new form of government. Now, the Declaration of Independence is probably without question the single most successful political document of the modern period. And what I mean by successful is that there's something about the logic of the Declaration of Independence. There's something about its rhetorical appeal. There's something about its power that makes it easily applicable, and it makes its message easily transferable to other causes. And so I want to take a look real quickly at the two other so-called declarations that we looked at today from American history. The first one is the Declaration of Sentiments. This was written, I guess you could say it was written, it's more like edited or adapted by a group that was convened at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Among this group was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and this document is often attributed to her. So, though I should point out, actually, his name might be at the bottom. If we look at the bottom, I think Frederick Douglass's name is on there. It is, yeah. So Frederick Douglass is the bottom left name. He was at this convention too. So this is the declaration, the so-called Declaration of Sentiments, one of the foundational documents of American first wave feminism. And if we just take a look at it, we don't need to look at much. We can see essentially what Stanton and others have done here. So they write, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect, etc., etc. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So part of what Stanton is doing here is simply pointing out that the logic, the moral logic of the Declaration of Independence really doesn't give any reason to distinguish between men and women. There's nothing in the Declaration of Independence to suggest that men and women ought to be treated differently, that women ought to be barred from holding property or holding office or barred from voting or whatever. So essentially, what Stanton's doing is making clear what was perhaps unclear in the original document, or she's making, as it were, the unwritten text, the written text. By which we mean, she's saying, listen, according to the Declaration of Independence, without any great um, discursive or rhetorical feats of strength, we can see that the Declaration of Independence, if we just think it through, the Declaration of Independence, if we hold its truths to be self-evident, then we also should hold these truths to be self-evident, namely that men and women are created equal, that there is no natural basis for their separation, that there's no natural basis for treating one differently than the other, and that there's certainly no natural basis for subjecting women to the rule of men, to the regime of what we call patriarchy. So first wave feminists, made great use of the Declaration. what we might today consider to be very obvious use of the Declaration, and simply pointed out that the logic of the Declaration of Independence suggests that a regime in which men control resources or exercise something like complete political domestic authority over their wives and children, that this is no free regime at all. And we see the same basic logic here in a document that is sometimes referred to as a Declaration of Liberty. This was a document produced by a sort of rebel band led by John Brown. I think the document itself, I think there's only one manuscript of, and I think it was composed, written by one of John Brown's sons. But we see them writing here: when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for an oppressed people to rise and assert their natural rights as human beings, as native and mutual citizens of a free republic, and break that odious yoke of oppression, et cetera, et cetera. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are. So, in other words, in the cause of anti-slavery, of abolition, right? They could just take the Declaration and say, listen, if this is the document that you think is important, if this is the document that you think the Constitution is supposed to reflect in some way, if this is the document which states the sort of moral purpose of the American project, it's very obvious from this document that we cannot possibly hold um, African and American born Black people in chains. In fact, nothing could be more obvious. And how obvious is it? It's so obvious that we can just take the original document, make a few edits here and there, and we can see that the logic of it carries over. Um, so this idea that natural law and natural rights, which goes with natural law, that it plays a kind of liberating role, right? This idea picks up steam in the 18th century and into the 19th century, into what is sometimes referred to as the Age of Revolutions. This is a kind of infectious idea, and we see an outbreak in the 19th century of revolutions all across Europe and across the European colonies of people essentially just seizing on the language of documents like the Declaration, the language of natural rights that we established in Locke's second treatise, and using them as a lever to leverage off regimes that are seen as oppressive. So we'll leave that off here today. Everyone have a good weekend, and we'll see you back next week.